Good morning, everyone. Please have a seat. There are several seats here in the front. You can also sit on the round tables in the back. Great to see a full house this morning. My name is Karin Olofsdotter, and I'm the Swedish ambassador to the United States, the best job a person can have. So happy to see you here today. Before I kick off with what I have here on my cards, I also want to congratulate you because you are some of the first people that to get to see our new photo exhibit. This is one of our most internationally renowned photographers, Lars Thun Björk. And he, among other things, explores, and he's fascinated, I should say, by people's loneliness and longing for meaning. But I think those of you who are here today cannot say that you are longing for meaning, because what you are doing is extremely meaningful. When we talk about climate, industrial policy, and innovation, there are few things that are more meaningful today than that. So if your mind wanders off, please enjoy the photography. And also, you might wonder, when we have this amazing house, in glass, transparent, light, why do we have a totally black room? And it's not because the architect ran out of ideas or we ran out of money. It is to give you a feeling of the darkness in the northern parts of Scandinavia during winter time. And then you open the door and you get into what we experience right now in Sweden with the fantastic spring light is coming. And so that's why. But it's also, of course, a good room to have a black room for exhibits and concerts and discussions like we're having today. So warmly welcome. So first of all, I must thank Mr. Carbon Exit and Resources for the future. And their special thanks to Åsa Lövgren and Dallas Bertraw for their partnership in setting the agenda for today. And also thanks to all the speakers we will listen to today who have come from afar and near to participate. And also, of course, to all of you who are just taking part in today's discussion here in the room. So last night we opened our new exhibit upstairs, Pioneer the Possible, Accelerating Green Transition. And I hope that you during either the small sandwich break you had here in the morning or during the coffee break can take a look at that as well. It's a lot about what Sweden is doing when it comes to industrial policy and change and innovation in this area. So today's discussion is a very timely conversation. Industry emissions must be tackled. We all know that. The last installment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 6th assessment report, just came out this week. And according to the summary, I quote them here, there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. That's quite harsh. And the choices and action implemented in this decade will have impact now and for thousands of years. So I think it's important that we have that in our minds and as a backdrop to the discussions we have today, thousands of years. We plan to be carbon neutral by 2045. And one of my country's main priorities is the green transition. And that's why I'm so thrilled to showcase our commitments in the exhibit we have upstairs. And we believe we have a great story to tell, that green transition is actually possible. And this is not something we have started, the last years. We started already in the 70s. We started then a transition from fossil fuels because of economic reasons. The oil crisis is in 1973. And actually, my father, he was a shoe salesman traveling all around the country. He had a huge Pontiac. He loved American cars. It was green, it was long, and it drank gasoline like nothing else. So he changed it for an Audi. He quickly, after having the Audi for a couple of years, switched back to American cars because he loves American cars. So I'm still driving his Chrysler from 1999, and I can assure you it's not a carbon-friendly car. Very convenient, though. And that's all because of the oil crisis in the 70s. And in the 80s and onwards, we have done what we are doing when it comes to green transition, not only of economic reasons, but also for environmental reasons. And also today, this relates to security concerns, given what we are seeing in our the awful war in our neighborhood and the need to wean ourselves off Russian oil and gas. So we are a strong proponent of the need to phase out fossil fuels as soon as possible, and this is both to improve security of supply and to reach our climate goals, so we can combine that here. And we really need to do a lot more, and we can't do it alone, of course. And production and manufacturing in Sweden is experiencing a major shift right now, and we see immense potential ahead to transform industrial sectors into sustainable industries. And many companies are adapting their operations for their circular economy. They feel their own need to change. The consumers want this, of course. Not of course, but they do. But they also know that regulations will make carbon dioxide emissions more costly. So across different fields and at every stage in the value chain, companies are joining forces to develop greener options. They are looking into things like alternative fuels and more energy-efficient technology. And at home, our industry is pushing the government to put the right frameworks and policies in place for the industry to become greener and more competitive at the same time. One thing we are looking into right now is, for instance, permits. It takes a very long time to get permits for different things in Sweden. It's much faster in the United States. And that's something the government has said that they will look into, for instance. And we will hear later today from Chief Technology Officer Ben Cowing from the Swedish steel producer SSAB. And they have groundbreaking and very exciting fossil-free steel production, also looking to do more of that in the United States. And in addition to what we are doing at home, we are also engaged on industrial decarbonization internationally. So together with India, we launched something called the Leadership Group for Industry Transition, and the acronym of them is LEAD-IT, which gathers countries and companies that are committed to action to achieve the Paris Agreement. And LEAD-IT members subscribe to the notion that energy-intensive industry can and must progress on low-carbon pathways, aiming then to achieve a net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Also, Sweden and some of the industry leaders are part of the First Movers Coalition. This is an initiative started by the US, and it harnesses the purchasing power of companies to decarbonize across 7 industrial sectors. And these sectors, such as steel and transportation, account for 30% of global emissions. And among the Swedish members of this coalition, we have Scania, bus and truck producer, SSAB, Swedish Steel, Vattenfall, Swedish energy company, and Volvo Group. And also to that note, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker today, David Livingstone. There you are, David. Sweden has worked with David the last couple of years on a needed transition in industry, in, for example, the First Movers Coalitions, and LEAD-IT as well. And now, David, here comes your CV. No, it's very long. It's very long. It's very impressive. So David comes from the U.S. Department of State. He is a senior advisor in the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. Prior to joining the government, Mr. Livingstone worked at the Eurasia Group, a consultancy firm, focusing on energy, climate, trade, and technology issues, and is as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He has also served as a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as the inaugural Robert S. Strauss Fellow for Geoeconomics at the Office of U.S. Trade Representative. And earlier in his career, when he was 14, because he's still a young man, he worked at the World Trade Organization and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. And before I hand over to David, I think it's really worthwhile repeating the words in the summary of the IPCC report. The choices and actions implemented this decade will have impacts now and for thousands of years. So think about that. So today you will hear about some of these actions and choices that we can make. But first we will hear from the US administration. So David, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to all of you who are here, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Olofsdotter, for the most generous introduction and eloquent opening to this event. It probably goes without saying that the United States and the EU, but especially the United States and Sweden, are incredibly close and like-minded partners on this agenda, as evidenced by the fact that the ambassador just basically gave my remarks in a much more concise, consolidated, and eloquent form. But if everything's been said, not everyone has said it. So here I go. Enjoy the next 10 minutes. It's a pleasure to be back here at the House of Sweden. It's my first time back here since the beginning of 2023. We have a beautiful art installation in back of us, and I'm happy to actually be quite the artistic juxtaposition to this exhibition on loneliness, because we have no need to be lonely when I see so many friends and faces of friends and partners in the audience, and we have no reason to search for meaning when the meaning is right here in front of us with the task ahead, pioneering the possible, driving forward industrial decarbonization and innovation in the transatlantic community. I particularly like the title of this event, Pioneering the Possible, because it reminds me, it was about 2 years ago when I had the privilege of helping to shape Secretary Blinken's first speech on the climate crisis that was given. It was given not far away from here, actually, in Maryland, out on the coast. And it was titled, Tackling the Crisis and Seizing Opportunity. I think that duality is very important to recognize. I like that duality. We're faced, undoubtedly and undeniably, with a generational crisis in climate change that will redefine the global economy, global security, and ultimately, not to get too philosophical too early in the morning, even our relationship to place, people, and time. But this great societal transition is also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to invest in ourselves, in our people, in our communities, to create solutions that will pay dividends for decades to come. It's an opportunity to lift up yet further the transatlantic community's superlative strengths, our diversity, our creativity, our industriousness in the face of this daunting climate challenge. Nowhere are those strengths more needed and, frankly, already more on display than when it comes to industrial decarbonization and innovation. We're here today to talk about sectors that are so often described as hard to abate, but I personally prefer demanding to decarbonize. And I mean that as a double entendre. I really do mean that the science demands the decarbonization of these sectors. There's no other choice if we're to meet our mid-century climate goals. But they're also demanding, in pursuing that agenda, of our utmost creativity and focus. They're demanding of us to find new ways to work together, new ways to bring solutions to the table. Now, turning here to the United States, I'm proud to say that we're doing everything imaginable to drive the transformation of key industrial products and processes in line with this imperative. Decarbonizing steel, cement, chemicals, aviation, agriculture. Think about these sectors. These are the things we simply cannot live without, and yet they come with emissions that we just can't live with. The answer is not to stop doing these things. The answer is not to shut down our factories. The answer is not to shutter in our industrial capacity. The answer is to work hand in hand on a game plan for competitiveness in a decarbonized economy. I'm proud to say our Department of Energy is already engaged in industrial decarbonization efforts that enjoy broad bipartisan support from Congress, including significant annual appropriations for research, development, demonstration, and deployment activities, RD&D. Just this week, the Department of Energy announced approximately $6 billion in a funding opportunity to accelerate decarbonization projects in energy-intensive industries and to provide manufacturers a competitive advantage in a global clean energy economy. Indeed, moreover, under the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have an even more impressive underpinning. $12 billion total for carbon management activities alone. That includes $2.5 billion for commercial-scale carbon capture demonstration projects, including 2 for industrial facility projects, $1 billion for carbon capture large-scale pilot projects, including in industrial facilities, and $500 million for industrial emissions demonstration projects, in addition to those other two. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act builds on that and includes some of the most ambitious incentives in the world to date for the deployment of carbon management and other technologies. That includes increasing the value of the US 45Q tax credit for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, increasing it to $85 per ton of CO2 for point source capture, including on industrial facilities. And this updated 45Q tax credit also includes, notably, a minimum project size for industrial carbon capture projects, which now enables community-based enterprises and smaller companies, smaller and medium-sized enterprises, the backbone of the American innovation ecosystem, and I know of Europe's as well. It allows those sorts of companies to participate and take advantage of these benefits also. Now, meanwhile, we're driving forward the precursors and other key inputs of industrial decarbonization. We all know what one of those are. They're a focus here in the United States, in Washington, and also in Brussels and Stockholm with our transatlantic partners across the Atlantic, and that's clean hydrogen, which you know will play a crucial role in decarbonizing many different industrial processes. The Department of Energy is currently accepting full applications to its $8 billion Regional Clean Hydrogen Hubs program to develop innovative networks of hydrogen supply and end uses. Initial applications propose a total of $157 billion in private investment alongside federal funds. In other words, if you build it, if you lay out these incentives, the private sector will show up and co-invest with great enthusiasm. These applications have also laid out in great detail and in great diversity how these projects can create good-paying, long-term jobs and support environmental justice across every region of this country. In support of this vision, the government's also announcing its intent to issue $750 million to dramatically reduce the cost of clean hydrogen electrolyzers, the enablers of the clean hydrogen supply that we will need, and to ensure that those supply chains for electrolyzers are robust, widespread, and diversified so that this transition is not slowed down by any single linchpin or choke point. To help guide all of this, last September, the administration released the Industrial Decarbonization Roadmap that identified 4 key pathways to reduce industrial emissions through innovation in manufacturing. The roadmap presents an agenda for government, for industry, for other stakeholders to work together to accelerate emissions reductions and position our industrial sectors as global leaders in innovation. Now, I work on international climate policy, and we're here also to talk about the transatlantic opportunity. So why harp so much on these domestic investments that we're making and those that are yet to come? So, to be frank, it's not just about pride. It's not just about talking and showing off about what we're doing here in the United States. These investments support the foundation for greater cooperation in the clean energy economy. When we make the United States a proving ground for the technologies of tomorrow, when we welcome investment from across the Atlantic, and when we drive a platform of investors that can also look to invest in Europe, and indeed when we do this around the world together, when we take on the tough emissions reductions, not just because they're easy, but because they are hard, and when we demonstrate the sort of leadership in these sectors that is going to be needed to bend the carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas curve, it's not just ourselves spinning our wheels. This is driving ahead the technologies that the world will urgently need to decarbonize, particularly from 2030 onwards. And when it comes to global impact, of course, it's not just about supply, but also about demand, as the ambassador noted. The US federal government is the largest direct purchaser in the world and a major infrastructure funder. Last year, the Biden-Harris administration launched the Federal Buy Clean initiative to leverage the $630 billion of annual purchasing power by the federal government to prioritize the use of low-carbon construction materials in federal building projects. In addition, through the First Movers Coalition, which we're proud to be co-leading with Sweden, the Department of State and the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, our office, has secured nearly 100 private sector commitments that represent $12 billion in purchasing power and demand signals. These companies are committing to purchase innovative, zero carbon materials from 2030 onwards. Now, I'm proud to say there's no single country that on a proportional basis dominates our activities in the First Movers Coalition like Sweden does. Sweden's, of course, a highly valued government partner, working to align wherever possible its policies, its investment activities, and its international cooperation in a way that fits the First Movers Coalition into the broader constellation of initiatives and efforts that we need to drive change. But we also count numerous Swedish companies, as has been mentioned, including Scania, SSAB, Vattenfall, Volvo, and more. These are companies that have made ambitious commitments under the First Movers Coalition, and we're deeply grateful to their participation. Thank you, Sweden. Thank you to your industry. Thank you to your government and to your civil society for the shared public-private leadership that continues to inspire us and so many others. We're also continuing to drive greater leadership on industrial decarbonization in international fora, as has been mentioned, such as Lead It and the Clean Energy Ministerial. The U.S. was proud to join Lead It in 2021 at the outset of this administration and sees great promise in further integrating Lead It work streams with other important international efforts. And then there's the Clean Energy Ministerial. Last September, the SEM CCUS initiative formalized a collaboration with the Global Cement and Concrete Association and its members. Under this new roadmap, CCUS will account for 36% approximately of decarbonization efforts, the single biggest lever of required CO2 reductions to achieve net zero concrete by 2050. I'm confident that the down payments that our governments are making together in carbon capture and storage, in hydrogen and other technologies will not only drive down emissions at home, but critically will create the tools, business models, and services that will see increasing demand in the decades to come and drive down the costs and expand access for those very things outside of our borders and economies as well. This in turn, just to sum up the theory of the case, makes our job as climate diplomats far easier. It allows us to work even more closely with partner countries around the world to help them map out a decarbonization blueprint and roadmap that actually creates jobs in their countries, as well as right here at home in the transatlantic space. Developing and exporting a full suite of decarbonization tools helps our climate diplomacy unlock more ambition in countries' Paris commitments, moves up the timeline of net zero targets, and brings the global political economy more in line with this climate action by making it more economically durable and sustainable. And in the realm of trade policy, in line with this virtuous political economy of decarbonization, I'll note that together the EU and the US continue to work together over the possibility of a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum that could be a groundbreaking, first-of-a-kind, multi-country framework for shaping trade flows in favor of lower carbon industrial products and production. We should not pretend that any of this work will be easy, but at the same time, we cannot pretend that this work is anything but imperative to a future of broadly shared prosperity both within and among our respective societies. I look forward to hearing the rest of the discussions today. We'll be keen to further explore the role that each of us, governments, industry, civil society, and beyond, labor, can play in creating this virtuous cycle between innovation, commercialization, deployment, and diplomacy that can drive climate action forward. In a world where the costs of inaction continue to rise and the costs of action through the innovative solutions in front of us continue to fall, we're right at the precipice of a major inflection point. The planet needs a business plan, and I believe that the most consequential decisions this decade and beyond will be made in the steel foundries, the cement kilns, the aluminum smelters around the world in our respective economies and beyond. So let's show that we're up to this task. Thank you very much for having me here this morning, and I'm looking forward to a terrific set of conversations to come. Thank you very much.
Global greenhouse gas emissions have continued to increase with unequal historical and ongoing contributions arising from unsustainable energy use, land use change, lifestyles and patterns of consumption and production, across regions, between and within countries, and among individuals. This is a quote from the IPCC report, as has been referred to already by both of my speakers before me. My name is Linda Andrén, and I will be the moderator of the first panel. And I'm Executive Director for Sweden-US Green Transition. And before I welcome the panel, I would just like to explain a bit what this is. And what we do with Sweden-US Green Transition Initiative is that we set out to accelerate the green transition. We are a joint initiative founded by the Embassy, the Swedish Innovation Agency, the Swedish Energy Agency, and Business Sweden. But with this reference to the synthesized report of IPCC, it is urgent, and we need change. And therefore, the topic of today's panels seems to be even more important: to decarbonize the basic material industry. So the first panel will be about technical pathways, and the second about policies. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome Ida Karlsson from Mr. Carbon Exit at Chalmers, Professor Philip Johnson from Mr. Carbon Exit at Chalmers, and Professor Andres Clarence, University of Virginia, and last but least, the Vice President and Chief Technology Officer, Ben Cowing from SSAB. Welcome. We will start with Ida to do a presentation about your research, and it's about materials in buildings.
That's right. So as we heard before from the ambassador, Sweden has already sort of gone through a transition before in this space when it comes to energy and buildings. And I want to start to set the scene, and I hope that in the slides here, you see the greenhouse gas emissions from buildings and infrastructure in the US, which accounts for about 37% of overall greenhouse gas emissions. And that's about the same level as you see on a global scale. And as you see, most of that, a majority of it, stems from the energy use in the building, and a smaller share from materials and the construction process. However, in Sweden, what we have seen from the oil crisis in the 70s, Sweden started transitioning. First, we built district heating networks that were using biofuels or waste energy plants. At the same time, installing heat pumps where necessary, and also at the same time also building regulations which requires highly energy efficient buildings. And that means that if you look at the Swedish, you see that it's the other way around. We have reduced emissions from the energy using buildings dramatically, and the share of materials and construction increases. And as we see, a lot of studies going forward is seeing this development happening everywhere, that the share of emissions from construction materials and the construction process increases. So we need to tackle this in order to have a chance to reach climate goals. So in our research that we've been doing at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden, we have been looking at different pathways. How do we go forward? How do we get to net zero emissions by 2045? And we've been mapping out where do the emissions come from. And we can see in the next slide that altogether we found that there's 3 major culprits in this. And we've already talked about these. So we have concrete, we have steel, and we have the diesel used in materials transport and construction equipment, accounting for about 70% of all the emissions associated with building and infrastructure construction. So we started looking at how can we then design a pathway going forward to reach net zero emissions. And we really found that it's collaboration that is the key. If we collaborate along the supply chain, all the way from basic material production, through material components or material processing, to the design of the structures, to you have a final building or infrastructure, that's where you really increase the potential. And if you see on the right, we find that if already now, by collaborating and using abatement measures such as resource efficiency, circularity measures, and some biomass or biofuel, you can reduce emissions by about 50% already when you're building a new construction or building a new building. So it really is key. And up to 2030, we see that we can reduce emissions by about 70% with those measures alone. But then, in order to really get to net zero, we need the transformative measures. We need the carbon capture in the cement plants, and we need electrification or other transformative measures in the steel industry. And with that combined, when we work along the value chains, which support each other, we can really enhance the acceleration towards the net zero emissions.
Thank you, Ida. And with a reference to carbon capture, I would like to welcome our next speaker, Philip.
Thank you very much. So is this working? Yeah. So yeah, about carbon capture and storage. So as was pointed out here, of course, there is an immense challenge ahead of us in reducing CO2 emissions and, of course, other greenhouse gas emissions as well. And basically, that means that at the mid-century, there can be no stacks from these factories emitting basically nothing. They can't emit carbon, but not the other greenhouse gases either. So that's, of course, a tremendous challenge. And I'm going to say a few words about this carbon capture and storage, which is actually a technology I wish there was no need for, because it's sort of an end-of-pipe technology. So, of course, this has to be part of an overall mitigation portfolio for these industries. And, of course, we can use less energy, we can shift fuel and technology, and we can also capture and store CO2, both from land use change, but also from this capture on flue gases. I think with looking at the energy transition in general, we have no lack of technologies. That's not the hurdle. The barriers are like how we can look forward and really embrace the possibilities that we have. But we do need, of course, a lot of compromises and realize that we need to face these new systems, whether it's siting of new wind power, solar panels, or changing in the way we live and transport ourselves. But Sweden, as I think have been clear, is a highly industrialized country, and we have quite a large number of large point sources of CO2 emissions, both from fossil fuel processes, but also with process emissions like cement factory, but also, and that is a little bit special to Sweden, a large number of biogenic emission sources from pulp and paper and combined heat and power plants burning biomass waste from the forest industry. So what is CCS then? If we can change the slide. Well, CCS is that you, from a stack, a fairly large one, you capture the CO2, compress it, pressurize it, and then transport it through either pipeline or ship transportation to a geological underground storage, deep under the seabed or deep under land. And the reason when looking at this is, of course, there is a large potential for storage. You have a CO2 as a gas and you compress it, it becomes a liquid, and then, of course, the volume becomes very small compared to in the gas phase. And also there are all around the world, large geological formations that are large enough to store large amounts of CO2. So what are then the challenges for CCS? Well, first, of course, is the cost, but that does not only go for CCS. Of course, it's the society that we are prepared to pay for enough to mitigate the emissions. And one can say that CCS defines the marginal cost of using fossil fuels, because there is no other way than either when it comes to burning coal or natural gas or oil, either to use CCS or to leave these fossil fuels in the ground. And the latter is what seems to be very, very difficult for societies, in particular those countries that have large endowments of fossil fuels. Then, of course, it's also a challenge to be able to choose between CCS and other technologies, because if there is an alternative to CCS, you would typically use that. So I think the steel is a very good example where they were for many years looking at CCS, but then turned to hydrogen-based steel, which is of course a much more sustainable way. So the opportunities then for CCS, well, first is to make deep emission cuts from fossil fuel plants, but also, as I mentioned in the introduction, to establish negative emissions by applying CCS to biogenic emission sources. But as was clear from these latest IPCC reports, and also actually a number of previous reports, is that not only need we to mitigate the emissions, we also need to create net negative emissions in the long run, because we simply have made an overshoot over the emissions to comply with a 1.5 degree warming target, or even 2 degree warming target. So, as I said, there are only for the fossil fuels, you need negative emissions, and for the fossil fuels, there are only these two alternatives. Either leave them in the ground or apply CCS, and of course a combination of those two. Yes. Yeah, I should show the last slide there. I had another. Just show some examples of large pond sources in Sweden, where now several industries are looking at CCS and actually transporting the CO2 that's been captured to a hub at the coastline, then transporting it to our neighboring country, Norway, at least for the first projects, and then they are very skilled in, due to, ironically, the oil and gas industry, to do underwater technologies, so drilling and then storing it underground. It's actually been applied since 1996 from an oil platform that's 1 million ton per year has been stored under the seabed. So, yes.
Thank you. And now over to how is it looking in the US? What technical innovations do you have to solve this?
Hi everyone, I'm Andres Clarence. I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Virginia. I want to thank the organizers for having me here. My research in this space is motivated by the question of not just how do we make industrial processes less bad for the climate, but also how can they contribute to a climate solution. So the reason that I'm optimistic about industrial decarbonization, and I think this is a really exciting space to be working in, is that we make a lot of materials, particularly certain materials, right? I could invent a process in my lab to make CO2 into meatballs, for example, and we couldn't eat enough meatballs, right? Even if we were all Swedish. But we do make a lot of construction materials. We move a lot of cement. We move a lot of plastic. And so if we could go to the next slide, I have been collaborating for a couple of years, about 5 years, with Bill Shobe, who's here, and colleagues at the University of Maryland, working with the team that puts out the US-based integrated model. And these are the models that go into the IPCC process. They are economic models at the end of the day, but this is a technology-rich integrated model that looks at the future state of the world economy and understands our role as engineers in this is how we represent emerging technologies as part of a large system, right? That includes the biosphere, it includes economic processes, it includes people. And so we can ask and answer questions about things like how some of these emerging technologies are going to have ripple effects on things like food prices, right? A lot of carbon removal, for example, is based on, there was a reference to bioenergy, right? And bioenergy with carbon capture is a possible solution, but that of course is very land use intensive. And so we're interested in understanding sort of the larger context, the larger implications of some of these emerging technologies. And over the past year or two, we've really been focused on industrial processes. And so this graph down below just shows how important, how big of a part of the problem these materials like cement and plastics are. Next slide. So I'm just going to quickly, I've got a slide for a few of these sectors and just tell you what we're seeing from our vantage point trying to model these. In GCAM, if you look at the cement sector, this is a sector that had a module for cement. It was developed in the 1990s, hadn't been updated since we approached it a couple of years back. And what we found by including emerging technologies in cement, in low carbon cement, into the model is that number one, the future of that sector is very, there's unlikely to be a technology that's going to replace ordinary Portland cement as a one-size-fits-all solution for all building practices. Number two, the type of technologies that we adopt are very sensitive to policy, and so we have heard about carbon capture and storage as a solution. The industry, from a US perspective, I think, is open to the idea of using carbon capture and storage as part of its portfolio, but it is going to try a lot of other things before then that might actually produce profit, not just make it a cost source. And so CCS is part of the solution, but so are emerging technologies. And I think the biggest takeaway from our work in this space is that even with all the interest and activity and innovation that's taking place in the cement world right now, we don't yet have the technologies to take this sector to anything approaching net zero. So in our model simulations, even when we give it these new emerging technologies, at best, emissions are flat or slightly down by mid-century, end of century. So the takeaway message here is that there's a lot of need for fundamental research in the cement world. Next slide. In the chemical space, similarly, there's a need for innovation, but I think here it's important to point out the distinction between materials and process heat, and the fact that there's an important need to manage all of the energy that we put into processing materials. This is true in cement as well, but it's not as much of a dominant storyline. But I think that another part of the story in chemicals is the fact that if we focus on long-lived products and we focus on getting more biogenic sources into our processing, then there is a potential to use chemicals manufacturing as a way to deliver carbon negative materials, carbon negativity at scale over the coming decades. And so, the various different regulatory and decision-making processes, as I had referred to earlier, I think that's really critical in all these sectors, but particularly in chemicals, as we think about who's incentivized and in what way to promote the production of these things. Next slide. Other metals are going to be talked about in a moment. I'll talk about non-ferrous metals, and I think the important story around non-ferrous metals, not aluminum, but copper and nickel, is just what a great potential some of these metals have to store carbon in their tailings and other materials that are generated through as byproducts of those industries. And so I think that that is the capacity of certain metal production processes could potentially exceed their emissions, and they could be net exporters of negative emissions if they were incentivized in the right way and if the technology existed. So I think that they, again, like these other sectors I'm talking about, have an opportunity not just to be a little bit less bad, but to actually be part of the solution. And then my last slide is just a picture of a building that was built in Charlottesville, where I live, about 2 hours south of here, that was wood framed. Interestingly, it was built on 3 stories of poured concrete for parking, which is not zero carbon, but the top part of the building is low carbon. And I think that looking at this building highlights the opportunity in the construction sector, which we already heard about. I think that there are opportunities to develop innovative practices and materials for this sector, but those are also similarly going to need to go through local regulations around policy, building practices, and so on, so that we can use the built environment also as part of the solution. So that's what I've got.
Thank you. And now, last but not least, Ben, would you be so kind to give us the perspective from industry on innovation, possibilities, and potentially barriers to entry?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've already learned that the steel industry is demanding to decarbonize. And I guess I really agree with that assessment. you asked what is the problem, and this diagram, if you look sort of to the top left, you will see, or really center left there, you will see the biggest problem. And it is the iron-making process, specifically the blast furnace. And I said the blast furnace is an iron-making process, but that's really from my perspective. From your perspective, it might be a CO2 making process, because it actually makes more tons of CO2 than it does iron. So it's a really large opportunity area. And a lot of folks have looked at that process and said, how can we employ things like carbon capture and make it better? SSAB has really come to the conclusion that in order to meet our goals, in order to meet the goals of Sweden and Finland, where we operate this process, we just have to get rid of it. It is not, we do not think that sticking with the blast furnace is the way to solve the decarbonization problem for the steel industry. So together with our partners, LKAB and Vattenfall, SSAB has formed the joint venture Hybrid AB. So Hybrid is hydrogen breakthrough iron making technology. And it is a true iron making technology because it doesn't produce a bunch of CO2. So the right side shows the hybrid process. And it actually starts with our partner LKAB, who is an iron ore producer. They operate mines in the north of Sweden, and they're actually converting those operations over to fossil-free production and certainly experimenting with different techniques there, so moving to electric rather than diesel-powered machines running about the place. But that's not where most of the CO2 is. So their pellet-making process takes iron, rock, hematite, grinds it up, puts it into cells to purify it a little bit, and then takes that powdered iron, forms it into a little bit of a BB. You can actually see some photos of what that looks like upstairs. Maybe more of a marble is the right size frame. And combining with some biological oils, they bake it and make us a nice solid pellet. That pellet then comes to the direct reduction process. So here we put into a continuous shaft all of these iron ore pellets. It's iron oxide, and the job of this process is to take away the oxygen. So a similar thing happens in the blast furnace where carbon is used to take away the oxygen, forming CO2. In the hybrid process, hydrogen takes away the oxygen. And the output of that process is H2O, which is not a problem to release to the environment as it causes no greenhouse gases. So the hydrogen needed for that process is produced through electrolysis. And our pilot plant is located in the north of Sweden, which currently has an abundance of green energy. So Vattenfall is one of the larger electricity producers in Europe. They're also our partner here, and they largely are the folks working on the hydrogen piece. So there's been a lot of science going on here, actually starting back in 2016. We were doing laboratory and so-called pre-feasibility techno-economic analysis, both trying to understand the science behind what we're trying to do, as well as what are the economic implications of those choices from a process standpoint. We believe firmly that hybrid will be really the correct technology for us, certainly for our operations in Sweden and Finland, where we do operate blast furnaces today. Just downstream of the hybrid process, you'll see a little schematic of or a little drawing of an electric arc furnace. So that's the technology we use in the US today. And we don't actually start with iron, we start with steel scrap. So our US plants are steel recycling operations that use electricity to melt steel scrap and then make products for our customers. And our Nordic operations are converting over to this electric arc furnace, so-called EAF technology. And so that's another big part of the hybrid program, because an EAF is also very suitable for melting solid direct reduced iron. And so that is our approach to the problem of the blast furnace. So at the very bottom, you see a timeline. Again, 2016, 2017, we were really in the laboratory, proving out the science, as well as doing preliminary economic assessments. The next stage was to build the pilot plant. So we actually have a large physical plant in Luleå, and it is using electrolysis, green electricity, making direct reduced iron. And we've actually made hundreds of tons of direct reduced iron. Now, hundreds of tons might sound like a lot, but it's not really a lot for us. A steel mill will typically make millions, or at least 1 million tons of steel per year, and that's what we consider an industrial scale. So right now, planning is ongoing for the industrial scale plant. Our target is 2026 for that. And similarly, our steel mills in Sweden, starting with our steel mill in Oxelösund, will be converting from their blast furnace-based operation over to electric arc furnace making, the technology we employ in Iowa and Alabama today. So I mentioned that economic analysis is also part of this program, and it's an important part because we don't know what the cost structures of 2026 looks like. I know anyone in the audience from Sweden today doesn't know how their power bill changed from last year to this year, right? What's your power bill going to look like in 2026? I can't tell you. But we have to make some assessments. We have to make some guesses as to what the electricity will cost us. Similarly, the other inputs, the logistics, all the things that change in the process have to be assessed. But right now, we're thinking it'll probably cost a little bit more to make steel through this process. So to help address that issue, we turn to other partners, and here the First Movers Coalition has already been mentioned. One of the members of that coalition, in addition to SSAB, is Volvo Construction Equipment. So if you go to the next slide, just last week, we had the largest construction equipment show this year in the world. So this is ConExpo in Las Vegas. And at that show, we had a nice announcement with Volvo Construction Equipment as well as SSAB present, and here handing over symbolic keys to a piece of fossil-free mining equipment there. So A30G is the name of the particular piece of machinery. But I mentioned that our pilot plant has made many hundreds of tons of this direct reduced iron. A lot of that has come to our plant in Alabama. We have melted it in our electric arc furnace. We have sent those slabs back to Sweden to make to the products that Volvo requires, and they have started making prototype vehicles. So similarly, there are other key customers we have partnered with to make some prototype quantities of their equipment out of fossil-free steel. And fossil-free steel is not inherently different from other steels in terms of the properties as the customer receives it. But of course, it has environmental benefits that are associated with that. And these are real science-based, data-driven environmental benefits. It's not somebody planting a forest somewhere far away that hopefully will stay there. This is us actually doing point source reductions at our steel mills, getting rid of the CO2. So in order to get that message to the customers, who hopefully folks will be willing to pay a little bit more for the steel-intensive products that they consume, when they know there's a highly creditable carbon reduction associated with that product. So we use the intermediaries, in this case Volvo CE is really proud to partner with us to announce that this vehicle is made of fossil-free steel, this prototype, and of course, I believe they're planning on making similar products available, as are many other partners who we're working with. So this partnering is the last piece. It's not the sciencey piece, it's the soft piece, but it's about getting the products out to customers, having them recognize the environmental benefits, and maybe helping us a little bit with the cost side of the new process to eliminate carbon. And that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing insights and giving us hope that even if it's urgent, there are solutions to this challenge that we are facing. With this, I would like to open up for questions from the audience. Yes.
In Washington, D.C. I have a question about the green steelmaking. And we've learned from David that, of course, the U.S. government is very interested in bringing costs down of electrolysis. Of course, this is also the ambition that we have in Europe. I wonder, and you've mentioned that back up in the north of Sweden, electricity is very abundant and also very cheap and clearly also zero emissions. So I wonder, when making steel for those prototypes you just mentioned, What is the overall cost component of those different elements that will allow you already in 2026 to bring products to the market that essentially have lower or cost competitive costs with the existing steel? So I really wonder specifically right now, what is the cost component of the electrolyzers, knowing that the electrolyzers aren't really cost competitive just yet? So thank you for more of an answer on this. Thank you.
So I'm certainly not an expert in electrolyzers, but I do try to keep up. So what I've heard from colleagues who are more knowledgeable in this area is that when we look at full lifetime costs of a hydrogen-based process, the CapEx and OpEx for electrolyzers are substantial, but the electrical input is the primary cost. So the actual electricity price to feed those electrolyzers is a very large component, much larger than the capital cost of the electrolyzers, and depending on which electrolyzer technology you need, sometimes I believe they have a refreshment cycle. But again, I think we heard about electrolyzers potentially being a bottleneck in this transition, and certainly happy to hear that our government is working to address that question. It is a big question because industry today does not use an awful lot of hydrogen, and most of that hydrogen is not green hydrogen that's used in industry today globally. So there are going to have to be an awful lot of electrolyzers produced, and it is certainly an issue. But again, the big economic input is the electricity.
Philip, you wanted to add?
Yeah, but absolutely, I agree with that. But one additional possibility with this electrification of industry in general and also other sectors is that we look at making the electricity system on the demand side much more flexible. So typically for industrial hydrogen, you combine it with a hydrogen storage where you could balance the non-dispatchable electricity generation, in particular wind power. So that is actually a great possibility in the future, combined with other like smart charging strategies for electric vehicles and so on. So we can get a much more efficient use of the renewables, not needing to curtail as we get more and more of that. And the other, I think there are some costs, the very rough cost estimates. You mentioned that it will be a bit more expensive still. So say, if it will be, say, 25-30% more expensive, we believe there is a premium market for it. But if you recalculate that additional cost to an end product, like a car made of fossil-free steel, it will be just less than maybe 0.5% more expensive. So that is also a great possibility, I think.
Just a small addition there. Part of the hybrid technology development program is actually a pilot-scale hydrogen storage facility.
Yeah.
So we're using a cavern, steel-lined cavern-based storage in the north of Sweden, where the caverns are available. So it's well suited.
Yes. Maybe here then in the front. The mic is coming.
Hi, I'm David Kirkpatrick. I'm a climate tech journalist. And Professor Clarence, you were politely did not talk about steel, but I'm curious if you would make some comments what your projections might be analogous to the other industries at a macro level of what you think is possible given what we've heard today and what you know.
It's a good question. I actually am not super familiar, mostly because the way that the GCAM is a big model, and there's people have their sort of lanes, and there's a separate group that's working on the steel problem. I know that they're very oriented towards China just because they're trying to understand, in conjunction with the Chinese partners, how technology transitions are going to look there. So that's a big part of the big focus of that research project. But in terms of direct comparison between steel and cement, I don't know those numbers off the top of my head.
Yes?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Linda Molnar from the National Science Foundation. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful presentations. I'm hoping we can get copies of the slides, perhaps, or at least the references. My question is for Professor Clarence. I was struck by something you said, and that was that in order to reach net zero for cement, we still need fundamental research, right, to come up with that innovation. We know that the construction industry is one of our so-called legacy industries, and it's ripe for innovation, yet it's still a low-margin industry. It tends to be. At the same time, there's both economic and environmental value in reaching net zero, obviously. So my question is, how do you think we can incentivize fundamental research scientists to work in this area? And how can folks like yourself help keep them on track for producing new technologies and innovation that can help us reach net zero? Because from a pragmatic standpoint, cement is the big culprit here, right, that we need to address in terms of the immediate crisis in front of us.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So we just got a NSF Partners for Innovation grant last week because the other side of my group is totally bench scale research on, I'm trained as an aqueous geochemist, so we do a lot of work on developing new materials, low carbon. Yeah. So we're doing some of that work on cement specifically, which is why I know more about cement than I know about steel. And so thank you to NSF for the support in that domain. I think that the point you raise is an excellent one, though, which is that groups, in my group, we have both the sort of systems level modeling that is able to sort of understand the supply chains, the techno-economic dimensions, and how it all fits together in addition to the fundamental chemistry and the new products. I think that's somewhat unusual. And so I think a lot of groups that are doing like fundamental chemistry will be like, oh, this is an interesting science problem. I'm going to work on that for the next couple of years. And that's somewhat divorced from the larger sustainability goals of like, well, that would be wonderful if we had that product or that process, but it's ultimately not going to make a huge impact at the global scale. And so I think that there is a fundamental need for some alignment because we just don't have time. As the IPCC report made, we need to like quickly accelerate the rate at which we do innovation. And I think the new director at NSF is a great effort to try and make those feedback loops tighter and get stuff out there. But I think that there's definitely a lot more room for improvement there. And I think that speaking specifically to the European-US bit, the US definitely has a culture of like startups and trying to support that. And I think the extent to which regulation was discussed earlier as a barrier. I mean, this is a complicated problem, and the extent to which we can figure out how to reduce some of these barriers to speed up fundamental discoveries at universities out into products that industry can use at scale, I think is a critical problem.
Ida, you also wanted to add to this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to give a perspective what's happening in Sweden. In Sweden, we actually have the concrete and cement producers come together in a large-scale research program. And they're looking at actually, identifying different sources of alternative binders to cement that can, replace some of the cement clinker. And testing it together, finding out like the most potential binders, and then also applying them in real projects. So we have the entire supply chain actually working together in large-scale research program to get them out there with everything from the testing all the way to application.
So I will make one more comment. So I am part of the new TIP directorate at NSF, and one of the newest programs there, the Convergence Accelerator, we do have a track on circular economy. And we do have several projects working on cementitious materials. And we do exactly what you're saying. We try to bring all the key stakeholders together at the beginning of the project, at the very fundamental research stage, so we can understand this process. And so hopefully I can engage with some of you on helping to coach those team members.
Thank you. I would like to ask for a final question from the audience, and then I will take the chance to have a question myself. I think that's a privilege I can do, right? Down there.
Thank you so much. Hi, Mikkel Drummond from Resources for the Future. If you look at a map of the world and how carbon dioxide travels around the world, we notice that carbon dioxide often concentrates in the upper northern atmosphere, areas like Sweden. With that, is Sweden located in a strategic position to uptake more carbon than any other location? And if so, what strategies and policies does Sweden plan to implement to do so?
Philip, do you feel like you could answer this?
No, as far as I know, there is no sort of strategy that departs in that sort of fact. So I think, as was mentioned here, we do have these programs of something called Fossil-Free Sweden, where sectors go together or have gathered and developed roadmaps for each sector, how to comply with the Swedish targets, which is to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by year 2045. And this is sort of a collective effort for each sector. So, but I mean, this work is not linked to the distribution of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Is that was what you meant?
So maybe the question pertains to direct air capture technologies.
Yeah,
I'm not knowledgeable in that area either.
We do have projects on direct air capture, absolutely, but those are very in an early phase. And of course, Iceland, which is not Sweden, they have very good conditions for storing CO2 because due to the chemistry of the basalt formations, actually the stored CO2 is converted within a year or so to solid material. So that's an opportunity. But of course, Iceland is located where it is, and our emissions are where they are. So maybe we can negotiate with Iceland. I saw there was an Icelandic flag outside here, so maybe
we can visit the embassy.
We can go upstairs after this meeting.
Or we can also pass the question to the next panel and see if they have a good answer to this in the policy discussion. So I would like to round up with a final question to all of you, and that is, what are the most important drivers to drive this forward?
I think what we heard before about the first mover coalition and those initiatives where you drive demand for low carbon products, then the industry will follow, and also like that combined with strategic collaborations, moving it forward like the hybrid example. Those things are really key, I would say.
If you had asked me only 3 years ago, I would have been a bit puzzled. But now in the European Union, I think we'll hear more of that, but the emission allowance prices in the EU ETS has gone up quite steep and are now at, say, $80–90 per ton. So that's one, definitely. And we are with the development of that policy, climate policy, we are envisioned even higher prices. So that's very good. So that's one driving force. The other important one is actually what you discuss is that we see for these companies that are in the end of the value chain, that they have themselves put up targets. For instance, Volvo Cars have a target of being climate neutral, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for year 2040, meaning that they would need fossil-free steel, and we have the hybrid H2 green steel. They would need carbon-free transportation of their vehicles, and then we have the Wallenius Wilhelmsen's sailing ship. So this kind of diffusion up through the value chain, I think is very important.
And all of us, we can support as well with our demand, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Andres?
A couple of weeks ago, I was in Kansas City at Ashgrove Cement, which is one of the biggest cement producers in the U.S., and they're owned by CRH, a European company, big materials company. And I was very impressed by how sophisticated the conversations were there. They have a lot of the same things we've talked about today in terms of questions about what the technology is. But I mean, I think that in the construction space, as Ida said, I mean, there's, the customers want this, developers want to build what the customers want, but developers can't build what they can't buy. They can't go buy the products without the primary manufacturing capacity. And so the folks that are making the materials, they are trying to figure it out right now in real time. And I think government can provide incentives, and I think that folks that are in research like myself can help provide solutions and think about how to get those to market. But I think that it's an exciting time. I think in the materials space, we're kind of like where we were with electric vehicles, 10 or 15 years ago, that we're like just at the cusp of it. And I think there's just a tremendous amount of potential today.
Yeah, I think it's been stated really well already, but I'll just repeat. I mean, government support is super important to get things started. We need support in order to develop new technologies. We need some support to deploy things that have not yet been proven. But really, market-based solutions are the long-term solution for this problem, right? We need to be able to get carbon neutral solutions to customers, to folks in our whole community that understand the problem and are willing to pay a little bit extra in order to get those environmental benefits. So yeah, market-based solutions and customer demand are absolutely the biggest driver and need to be.
Thank you. Please all give this nice panel a warm applause for sharing their knowledge. And now it will be 5 minutes to just change the panel, right? Yeah, so bear with us. 2 minutes.
Take our seats again for the second panel. So my name's Carolyn Fisher. I'm the research manager for sustainability and infrastructure at the World Bank Group, but a longtime collaborator with Sweden and the former senior fellow at Resources for the Future, former Marx visiting professor at Gothenburg University, and a longtime participant in MISTRA projects. So I'm very grateful for the opportunities that all of these wonderful institutions have provided me. And I'm particularly excited about today's event, Pioneering the Possible, and talking deeply about industrial decarbonization. These are really important sectors to meeting the climate challenge. They're both emissions intensive, but also trade exposed. And so that means it's challenging to meet this decarbonization challenge without in a ways that don't give competitive advantages to industries that and producers that are using conventional and emissions intensive methods. So there's a delicate balance in the policy space for tackling industrial decarbonization. And we're going to be talking about that today. This panel is on the policy pathways to decarbonize the basic materials industry. And I'm very pleased to have 4 experts here. We have Alan Krupnick, Senior Fellow and Director of the Industry and Fuels Program at Resources for the Future here in Washington. Next, we have Lars Zetterberg, who's a Senior Specialist and Project Leader at IVL in Sweden and also Director of our MISTRA Carbon Exit Program. Then we have Milan Elkerbout, who's a Research Fellow and Head of the Climate Policy Program at the Center for European Policy Studies in Belgium and also a member of MISTRA Carbon Exit. And then finally, we'll hear from Dagmar Koska, who's the Deputy Head and the Counselor for Climate and Energy, Global Issues and Innovation. It's a big portfolio at the EU delegation to the USA. Okay, and we're going to run this panel more as a conversation to talk about the different policy strategies in the US and the EU. So I'd like to start with Alan Krupnick here. And so, we've had some recent, big legislation passed in the US, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So maybe you can describe some of the key features of these laws in terms of promoting industrial decarbonization.
Sure. I want to say first that David Livingston did a really nice job describing these laws. So I just want to highlight a couple of things. The first thing is these laws focus on money for innovation when we're talking about industrial decarbonization, money for innovation for R&D, D&D, as was mentioned before, and tax credits. Now, and particularly focused on the precursors of industrial decarbonization, which would be hydrogen and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. CCUS is really important in the US because natural gas is cheap and it's ubiquitous. So if you can capture the emissions, if you can still use the natural gas, which is so cheap, but capture the CO2 emissions and either store them permanently or through various means of utilization, then you're ahead of the game. So, but one major class of government actions are missing from all of this, which is regulatory actions. And when we're talking about European efforts, you've got a cap and trade system, which we don't have for the United States. And we don't have a carbon tax. Some countries do. So if we're talking about incentives for industry, if we're talking about markets moving forward, if we're talking about getting demand going, then some of these regulatory tools need to get put in place. And that we don't have. And we don't have the agreement in Congress to do this. There are some bills floating around, but it's getting harder and harder to see how they would pass. So, should I?
Well, maybe let's push down that a little bit. So, so the laws that have passed rely heavily on subsidies, and instead of regulatory sticks, as you point out.
Sure.
So, can you talk about some of the effects that this approach will have, and what the challenges are of this?
Sure. So, something that we've studied what's called 45Q. That's the carbon capture, utilization, storage tax credits, and the hydrogen tax credits. These are very different animals. The CCUS credit is a credit of $85 a ton for storing carbon. It doesn't look at the life cycle of what went into those captured CO2 emissions, whereas hydrogen has a sliding tax credit that depending on on the carbon intensity of the full life cycle, the less carbon intensive that is, the greater the credit you get. So that sounds good. But the big issue, and the one that we're all waiting to see how the government will handle it, is rules that need to be written by the Treasury Department, and specifically the IRS. And the issue is this trade-off between rules that will stimulate hydrogen production, let's say through green hydrogen, that is with electrolyzers, that will really stimulate that, but in so doing, it's going to use a lot of dirty electricity. Because these electrolyzers need to run 24/7 to be remotely economic. So that's on the one hand, you want to stimulate hydrogen production. On the other hand, you want to reduce CO2 emissions. And if there's even a little bit of coal in that generation mix, you can easily negate the benefits of clean hydrogen. So where the Treasury Department ends up in writing these rules on this trade-off is going to be critical for the future of hydrogen. And my own feeling is, just to put it out there, is that we ought to err on getting hydrogen going. And if it means there's more CO2 emissions in the short run, then to me, that's a worthwhile trade-off. Because eventually, the electricity system is going to be carbon-free, or nearly so. So let's get the hydrogen economy going, because it's a precursor to so much industrial emission reduction, and get that going, and not worry so much about CO2 emissions in the short run.
Thanks, Alan.
Okay.
So Lars, maybe that's a nice contrast. So as Alan mentioned, in the EU has for a couple decades now been regulating greenhouse gas emissions with the emissions trading system that applies to the power and industrial sectors. So looking forward, so there have recently been some reforms to the ETS. Is this going to be a policy to count on? Is it fit for the challenges of the next decades?
Yes, thank you, Carolyn. So just recently in December last year, the different EU institutions, so the Parliament, the Council and the Commission, they agreed on a new climate package. It's called Fit for 55. It's not an exercise program for people like me, but it refers to the target for 2030 to reduce emissions by at least 55%. And so this was a very important package. It had different components. One was to reform the EU emissions trading system. This is a cap and trade system, so you put a cap on emissions and you allocate allowances to industry, and they have to render these allowances that correspond to their emissions. So it's a market-based instrument that creates incentives to reduce your emissions, because then you don't need these allowances. And this scarceness of allowances, which you create by reducing the size of this cap, that creates a price on allowances. I'm not sure if you can see. Yeah, great. So the graph there shows how the price of allowances has changed since 2010 until today. And as you can see, from about a 6-year period between 2012 and 2017, the price was very, very low, about €5. This was definitely not creating these incentives for emissions reductions. But then the system was revised in 2018, and actually it was a Swedish proposal that was very important because there was a surplus of allowances. There were too many allowances, and this Swedish proposal resulted in the cancellation of about 3 billion tons of CO2. So that immediately made the price go up to about €30 immediately. And €30 was very important because that pushed out fossil fuels from electricity production in Europe and made solar and wind profitable. Now the system has been reformed, as I said, and it's actually even more ambitious than before. So this cap that is being reduced is going to be reduced about twice as fast as before, which means that it will reach zero at about 2040 instead of 2058. So in 2040, there will be no allowances issued at all. And that's quite a big change. A second important thing is that they're phasing out so-called free allocation. So some of the industries that are in the system, so basically steel producers, cement producers, that are under international competition, they are allocated allowances for free in order to avoid that they shut down and move outside of the EU. But this is problematic because it creates an unlevel playing field with these industries that produce green steel, for instance. They do not get free allocation. But that is now going to be phased out over a 10-year period. So in 2033, that will be the last year when there will be free allowances.
Thank you, Lars. Do you see? How is industry in the EU seeing these changes in the ETS going forward?
Well, I think they welcome it, of course. I mean, there's, as we've heard here, the industries are often in the front line and ready to implement these new technologies, but they need incentives to do it. So it has to be more expensive to emit. And with this reform here, it seems like we're going to have much higher prices for a sustainable amount of time. In order to make green steel compatible with traditional steel, you need a price of about €100 per ton. And we actually reached €100 for the first time a couple of weeks ago. So this is definitely, I mean, the high price in combination with the phase out of free allocation, that creates a much better business case for industry. And I think that will lead to an acceleration of the industrial decarbonization in Europe.
So I think that's a nice segue over to Milan, because another important reform is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So maybe you can tell us, why did the EU pursue the CBAM, and what is its role going to be in decarbonizing industry?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. So Yes, CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's one of the many acronyms produced in Brussels. And it is really intended as an alternative to the free allowances that Lars has already been talking about. There is this risk of carbon leakage, at least there's the perception of it, that companies might move out of Europe if Europe is the only one that has a high climate policy ambition, a high carbon price in place. And the idea of CBAM has been on the table for quite a long time. It's sort of logical that if our producers in Europe face this cost and American, Chinese, Turkish producers do not, then that creates a competitive disadvantage. So you want to have a level playing field. And one way to do that is to charge a similar carbon price to importers of energy-intensive industrial goods into the EU market. And this is what CBAM is trying to do once it starts being implemented in a few years' time. It operates a bit like a virtual emissions trading system. So there will be regulatory authorities that look at what the ETS price was a week before a good was imported, and then you take the average price and create virtual allowances that need to be bought. But if you think about the design of such a system, it does get quite complicated. You need to make a lot of choices on what type of products it applies to. And the scope of CBAM is quite a bit smaller than that of the ETS as a whole, because we have hundreds of sectors, some which are really small. And since this is quite a new endeavor in policy terms, we really want to focus only on the most basic, the largest sectors, such as steel and cement and the chemicals production. There's a few other controversial issues. So the idea of charging importers a similar carbon price is pretty straightforward. But a lot of the production in Europe is also for exports, especially in a large country such as Germany. And you could come up with a very easy theoretical solution, which is that you rebate the ETS price paid. But this becomes very controversial also in trade terms, because then you're doing an export subsidy in a way, which is sort of the biggest in international trade. So they try to avoid doing that. If importers are paying anything at all, then someone is receiving that money. And in an ideal world, that would have been recycled in a certain way, especially if it's coming from developing countries such as Mozambique, which is a fairly large aluminium producer. That didn't happen simply because for the EU institutions, it's very difficult to get money and be able to spend it themselves. It's a fight every 7 years with the member states. So getting some of that own resources, own revenues was very important, and also making it attractive for the EU legislators to vote for it. So how will this help decarbonization? Well, ideally, if companies in Europe do not need to worry about their own competitiveness as much because other trade partners need to face similar carbon costs, then that should make it easier for them to invest in these radical breakthrough technologies that we also heard about this morning already. Do I therefore think that this is sufficient in actually getting this going? No, not really, because there's also a lot of other barriers before large multinational companies are willing to put their signature under multi-billion-dollar investments. You have very high upfront investment costs, and you really need to be convinced that there is a market for these goods. But there has been a very significant development, actually, thanks to the US, because the Inflation Reduction Act caused some anxiety in Europe. And with the Net Zero Industry Act, that's a new industrial policy of the EU. We try to create much more of the carrots as well, not just the sticks. But I think, you will also talk about this.
Okay, yeah. So maybe we'll invite Dagmara then to speak about this new EU Green Deal industrial plan. So what objectives does it pursue, and what are the main elements? Because it's a new addition to the package that includes the ETS and Fit for 55.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting and important conference. And I think we know when we look at our targets, we simply know that there's such a big effort still to be done on decarbonization. And while we really started with the low-hanging fruit, I mean, I think that the less low-hanging fruits are in the industrial sector. And so this pioneering conference is indeed very timely. Now, you planned it ahead of the EU Green Deal industrial plan being unveiled, but I think the timing couldn't be better for me to be able to present it to you. The EU Green Deal industrial plan is clearly rooted in the climate neutrality quest. So this quest has a number of legs and a number of developments, and of course we started with the EU Green Deal already some time ago and have really over time implemented it with a number of areas and really across the economy. And clearly the Fit for 55, which was mentioned, was meant to bring in the legislation that will be necessary. We have a climate law in Europe that essentially puts into law our obligations to reach our 2030 goals, our 2050 climate neutrality. The Fit for 55 was meant to provide legislation on sectors specifically in order to be able to reach that goal. So the goal in itself, even if it's binding, couldn't get us there unless we really had the means to implement it per sector. And so obviously then we faced the pandemic, the green recovery was our answer. We created the Next Generation EU with additional firepower, of course, to help us recover from the pandemic in a green manner. And then we faced the war. And clearly what the war has shown us is that we need more resiliency. We need to address the dependencies. And clearly with the war, we, first and foremost in the last year, we're reducing our dependency on Russia. But as we transition, and as this year, clearly also over the year, we've seen that green transition is for us the way to make us more energy secure and also to be able to decouple from Russia and those dependencies that were created over centuries and really were historic. So we also saw that we were able to accelerate the green transition while also diversifying. And so over a year, unprecedented things have happened that have allowed the EU to come up with this Green Deal industrial plan. Because the Green Deal industrial plan is our cherry on top. Is simply adding to everything else that was in place, and now we're focusing on the net zero economy and the net zero technologies so that the European Union can be and continue to be the leader in this space. And so very clearly this is not an answer to the IRA, even if it's perceived that way, because it's not only in the United States that countries have realized that really this is a quest and this is a economic edge and a competitiveness edge that really betting on clean technologies, net zero technologies can allow us to be competitive in the long term. I would like to say that also the way we approach this is obviously through partnerships. This is also the lesson we've learned last year. The resilience can be created through partnerships, and so the Green Deal industrial plan clearly sets out the partnership as the core of our answer, and diversification is in technology, not only in clean energy or energy as such, but diversification is part of that partnership quest. So all in all, I will be happy to go into more detail what it is, but this is the why, so to say, the why of the EU Green Deal industrial plan.
Just maybe a few of the specifics that you could give in contrast to the IRA and the approach for the Green Deal industrial plan.
Absolutely, I'm very happy to. So the EU Green Deal industrial plan, initially in early February, it was a plan and had a number of ideals there and already objectives. And now only last week we came up with from the European Commission specific proposals. So these proposals, as you know, the European Commission is the executive that also has the right of initiative and proposes laws and regulations. And this obviously will go through the legislative process with the member states and parliament, but already I can give you, and so it's not law, even if it's out there, but it's not law, it's a proposal for law. But I would like to give you a little bit of a direction of where this law will take us if it's adopted. And once it's adopted, and I really think that it should be a high priority to be adopted. So there are 4 big pillars of this work. Number 1 is the simplification, regulatory environment that will be able to curate those net zero technologies. And here, of course, following that space, clean energy and climate, we know very well, and we've heard from the first panel, that the acceleration of permitting is really key. These technologies cannot take 5 to 10 years to be deployed. They really have to be deployed once they can be demonstrated within a year or a maximum 2. And so in the Net Zero Industrial Act that the Commission proposes, the Commission names a number of strategic net zero technologies, and for those technologies, it sets out specific objectives in terms of how long or how short, in fact, the permit granting should be. And not only in timelines, but also simplification on the regulatory procedure, one-stop shops. And I think that's key. And because one-stop shops, and because of those limits in terms of time, it will be necessary to, in fact, staff those authorities so that they will be able to deliver. Because indeed, some of those technologies also could have environmental impacts. And so how to make sure that while we accelerate, we don't compromise. We do not compromise environment. So these are the difficult balance trade-offs that we are trying to meet. And I can mention those technologies later on, and also mention what exactly that means for CCS, hydrogen, and so on and so forth. But I would like to say is that this is the one pillar. Another 3 pillars are finance, facilitation again, access, and we have heard that from the ETS there is a lot of revenue, there's incentive, there's market creation, but there's also revenue. There's skills, and also the trade. And I think to your point, Caroline, what that means in comparison, I think we clearly in the EU, we know that we are already so meshed in the global trade that for us this is part of the solution. We do still will continue under this plan to foster partnerships with select countries, but also free trade agreements. And we will still put a lot of pressure on reforming the WTO. Because what we did on CBAM was WTO compatible, and we do feel that that's the way to go. Those partnerships are key, and I think we are also very keen to work with the United States on the partnerships so that the IRA, so to say, can be also an opportunity for Europe. But we in Europe also want to entice others to be able to partner with us so that the green transition can create benefits for all.
Thank you. So maybe let's follow a little bit on that, but I want to open this to this question for all the panelists, because we hear a lot talk about these policies, that these are policies to give the EU and the US a clean, competitive edge. But these are technologies where we're fighting a global problem, and we want to lose that competitive edge because we want these technologies to really be disseminated worldwide. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what implications there are within these approaches for assisting, incentivizing, helping the transition and decarbonization of industries worldwide and not just in the EU and US.
Well, I have some thoughts that your last phrase just threw me there. There is a movement, political movement in the United States to onshore, it's called, which basically is about trade restrictions. And the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law do have a number of places in those laws, those requirements for domestic content. So you get extra credit, is the way it's put, bonuses or something, for having more domestic content. There's ineligibility for tax credits in certain cases if you're a foreign corporation, even if you're operating in the United States. In the one recent example, I can't be positive about this because the Department of Energy has such a lack of transparency, but the Hydrogen Hubs program discouraged an application from Alaska to produce hydrogen and then export that hydrogen to Asia, where they had consumers that were willing to sign up to this hydrogen hub proposal. So this hub would not be co-located, right? You'd have producers in Alaska and consumers elsewhere in the world. And that proposal was discouraged by DOE in its preliminary review. And this isn't a final proposal. Alaska may very well come back with a proposal anyway. But these discussions that are these requirements that we're facing are not so good for the spread of technology. And this idea that why does the United States have to be, the leader in all the technology? We have hybrid. Let's learn from that. We can free ride on the rest of the world. Why do we have to do it all ourselves? I mean, this free trade, I'm an economist. Free trade is like a good thing, and we want to have more of that, as opposed to putting barriers up. And I'm afraid that that's going to be part of the story. I don't want to lose sight of the amazing progress that we're making in the United States on CO2 mitigation, but it is, as you say, a worldwide problem. So we need worldwide solutions.
Okay. Lars?
Yeah, I mean, somebody has to be first, and it's not easy to find first movers. So I think these industrial support systems, both in Europe and United States, are very important to bring these new technologies online. And once we have green steel and green cement and so on, I'm sure there will be spillover effects for the rest of the world to learn from this. Also, I think it's not only, I should note, it's not only a cost for Europe and the United States to be these first movers, because I'm sure there will be business opportunities for those that can provide these new green materials. And then I'd like to stress on the CBAM, it has an interesting side effect that it actually incentivizes the development of clean technologies outside of Europe as well. So because you have this mechanism that if you import products from outside of Europe, it's you need to put a surcharge on it that corresponds to the carbon price in Europe, and that creates an incentive for these countries to introduce their own carbon pricing, because if they have that, they won't have to pay the tariff in Europe. So that way, you're sort of spreading the incentives for green technologies.
Thank you, Mara.
Just a few points on
why and how we could be enmeshed in the global system. Clearly, with the clean energy transition, we need critical raw materials at the, let's say, top end of the cycle. And what we realize right now clearly is that we are very dependent on a number of elements in the supply chain of critical raw materials. And so how we approach this is that we set specific benchmarks when it comes to different parts of the chain. So to give you an example, when it comes to extraction, we would like to have 10% of the extraction in Europe of the final products that will need those critical raw materials. For processing, 40%, recycling 15%, and never should we have more dependence on one source than 65% from sourcing from one source of 60% of demand. So you see that already those numbers give you a understanding that for us it's we want to be in the game along the value chain. We want to have domestic, let's say, competitive advantage and edge, but we are very realistic. We are not going to make it all alone at home. So onshoring only to a degree, where it does not distract from, again, open and fair trade, and only if it's still cost competitive. Because when now we bring out these proposals, also public procurement is going to be in focus. One article is devoted to public procurement there. The resilience and sustainability will play a role. And if they're not assured, proposals can be downgraded, but will not be discarded outright, you see. So I think these are quite a number of concrete examples why I think Europe wants to be, like I said, enmeshed in the global system and in partnerships on a number of those critical technologies and materials leading for those technologies to be maturing.
Okay, thanks. Do you have a quick comment you'd like to say? Because I also want to invite questions from the audience.
No, on front runners. Yes. I mean, the fact that US taxpayers are now making low carbon technology cheaper is the number one reason why Europeans should be happy with IRA, I think. One thing that's also very good news, which links to the first session, is that there will be a quantitative target for storing CO2 by 2030, 50 million tons. And that can really help accelerate that, because there was a bit of a sector where you had a chicken and egg problem. Everyone was waiting for everyone else to move first.
Yeah, thank you. Questions from the audience? Over here. Okay, I'll repeat the question then.
Thank you for interesting talks. So I'm Johan Lucian. I also work in the Mr. Carbon Exit Program. And I've been interested in... It works? All right.
Yes, okay, good.
I've been interested in industry decarbonization for quite a long time. So you've been discussing all of these carrots being presented on both sides of the Atlantic, which I think is welcome and needed. But maybe some of you up there can comment on how, can you say something basic about the guardrails that needs to be in place that make sure that we get the maximum bang for the buck when it comes to this money, when you look back at other similar support schemes. Yeah. So, question to any of you.
Yeah, maybe just to rephrase. So, often subsidies in particular are often used for new to support new technologies and spillovers that you may have from them. But since this is also aimed at really trying to decarbonize quite quickly. So what are ideas for policy designs that can help ensure that, you know, a faster meeting of actual emissions goals? And Alan?
Well, I'm going to go in it's a slightly different direction, but there are some necessary conditions for this whole system to work, and we don't have them yet. And the first big condition is pipelines. And along with that, for broader infrastructure issues is permitting. And the Swedish ambassador mentioned permitting in her remarks and made it sound like the United States permitting is really easy. No, it is not. It's a mess. And so on the pipelines, we have 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines or so. We have 1,500 miles of hydrogen pipelines. We have hundreds of thousands of miles of natural gas pipelines and oil pipelines. We're going to need a pipeline network to get the CO2 from the sources to the sinks. We're going to need a hydrogen network to get the hydrogen from the producers to the off-takers. How is this going to happen? It's very difficult in the US now to get major pipelines approved. It takes many years. And for these types of pipelines that we're talking about here, for the natural gas pipelines, the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has responsibility for interstate natural gas pipelines. Well, that's not the case for CO2 and hydrogen. And in fact, there's a lot of ambiguity about who ultimately has responsibility when they're interstate. Within a state, then the state government has responsibilities, regulatory responsibilities. So there are a lot of open issues here, and we need reform. And then more generally, the permitting reform, because it's not only pipeline infrastructure, there's a lot of other infrastructure, and siting of all these these are actually industrial facilities, even for CCUS and hydrogen, let alone new or modified industrial plants. And let me bring up, for veterans of the Clean Air Act, the new source review is, I see some people know what I'm talking about. If you modify like a steel plant modifies itself to use new technologies, that's going to throw it in the new source review. And this is another potentially very costly regulatory set of requirements that come into play. So that's one. And the second one, and then I'll shut up, is environmental justice. Environmental justice is a huge issue in the United States, as well it should be. But the environmental justice community, which has increasing clout, is on record. I mean, there's always, I don't want to classify that or characterize that community as completely homogeneous, but they're pretty homogeneous on opposition to hydrogen and carbon capture. And these are two main pathways that we're looking at. So how is this going to get resolved, this political issue? And we're not paying nearly enough attention to that now.
I think that's a great point, that there's a lot of enabling context that needs to happen for these incentive-based policies to work. And now I think a diplomat would like to say something.
So of course, I mean, to your point, Alan, about how to make sure that we prioritize exactly what we need to do, because the pathways are known to us. And what does it mean then for enabling conditions, for the regulations, for the project promoters to be able to have the certainty that they can roll things out, right? Because it's not only on the end of the technology, siting of the technology, but also all around the technology. So the way we go about this let's say attempt to prioritize is that we have strategic projects, right? Like there were this is historically relevant for the European Union because, of course, as a European Union 27, we were, in the past and still are prioritizing, let's say, a cohesion within the Union, right? Integration within the Union. But now we know that also we need to prioritize and strategize about how to make sure that these projects realize. So essentially, these strategic projects that I mentioned, and CO2 networks, hydrogen networks, they will all have a strategic project label, and that essentially will ensure access to finance, easier access to finance, one-stop shops, regulatory acceleration, and so on and so forth, right? Then we have those standards, and I think your question went actually more into, okay, we have those strategic technologies. How do we make sure that they actually deliver in terms of emissions? And I think it's a very, very valid question. And the standards, the regulatory standards, are absolutely a necessary component of that story, because we need to make sure that we measure what really is the outcome of those experiments. The public money is scarce, so we really need to make sure that we get the back for the whatever the bang for the back. And so the way we do it is, again, like on hydrogen, for instance, we set out a delegated act on specifically what the green hydrogen requirement would be in order to be able to make sure that we have as much of it and that it really creates an environmental advantage and benefit. We have eco-design standards on appliances, for instance, which are very, very relevant in order to make sure that the energy efficiency in buildings is really to the highest standards, and the environmental performance, sustainability. Water use, for instance, of some of those products is very good. And then the Innovation Fund, which for us is the money that we get from the EU ETS, from the cap and trade, and pump it into large-scale demonstration projects in essentially emission reductions. It has very specific requirements when it comes to scalability, but also CO2 emissions. And so when we gave out by now already 3 billion for 70 projects so far in less than 3 years, we essentially we know exactly how much emissions these projects will save. And that Innovation Fund is only now turbocharged, of course, with the Fit for 55, but also with the higher ETS price, we will have over the 7 years, 40 billion euro alone from that, let's say, source of revenue in order to support hydrogen in particular. The Hydrogen Bank that was also unveiled last week will be already this year calling for 800 million, for instance, on hydrogen projects for green hydrogen. By the end of this year, the first call will be launched. So you see, but then again, those performance criteria, standards are very, very important for us.
Okay. So I think we're running short on time, but do we have time to take a couple questions, or should we have it done informally? Maybe one more question. Okay. Then you're in the front.
Yeah, I'm thinking about I mean, we all know that the geopolitics is maybe at the moment the trend is not really that positive with, of course, Russia's aggression on Ukraine and of course also China question marks. So I wonder, maybe this is a bit wide question, but if anyone wants to reflect on this work on decarbonization related to what you said about the US and Europe as potential forerunners, will that will result in possibilities to improve the global geopolitics, or will it be the other way around? I don't know if it's maybe difficult, but could you speculate a bit?
Yeah, some brief final thoughts from Milan and Lars.
No, there's definitely a risk that if large economies of the world engage in an industrial policy race, that this fragments the trade system. That isn't necessarily a good thing, but there are countervailing initiatives that are still ongoing. The EU and the US have the Trade and Technology Council, but it's at a very technocratic level, not very geopolitical. Climate clubs and alliances are also a thing where you could, well, I wouldn't say harmonize, but at least coordinate things like standards, how you measure embodied carbon in goods. Those will be good things. In general, though, with this whole subsidy risk, there is also a bit of a risk of putting your eggs too much in one basket, and I think maybe both the US and the EU have a risk of doing that with hydrogen, which is both absolutely essential for a net zero economy, but there's a great many uses of hydrogen that are massively stupid, like fuel cell vehicles or heating your homes with it. So also need to avoid things where you have clearly better alternatives.
So Lars?
Yes, I mean, a couple of reflections on the new geopolitical scene we're seeing here. So, I mean, the war, the aggression from Russia in Ukraine, it sort of created tremendous incentives for Europe to phase out dependency on Russian gas. And the only solution to that in the long term is, of course, to speed up the rolling out of renewables like wind and solar. And there has been initiatives in this direction, but of course this takes time. It's nothing you do over a couple of years. And that hinges also on the permitting processes, that you need faster ways to get these new sites permitted. Like in Sweden, as you know, there's these sea-based wind farms which can take 10 years to get permissions from. And so that's one aspect, but also we talked about critical minerals here and the need for securing the supply of these to Europe and the United States, and there's initiatives in these directions, but we'll never be self-supportant of these minerals. I don't think in the US or in the EU, so there will always be trade, but the idea here is to diversify and make good use of those the international trade there is, but at the same time be more careful so you can secure these supplies to Europe and the United States.
Thanks very much. And I think there are a lot of great points here about the interlinkages between the EU, US, and the rest of the world in combating these challenges. Okay, well, thank you very much. Let's thank our panelists. And I believe we have just some closing remarks. Yes. Should we just, we can.
Yes, I've been asked to do concluding remarks, but how can I do that? It has been a great and fantastic panel. So much insights, so many acronyms. I have long lists of papers here, and I do think it's impossible to do that when we are short on time as well. But some words, learning from each other, I think that is fantastic. If we can continue to do that from both sides of the Atlantic, and the collaboration, the interdependencies between from government, academia, and to the industry, and to us as consumers, we all have a responsibility to increase the demand. I do think it was nicely put by Mr. Livingstone that the financiation that is now in place, that is a foundation for collaboration. And I do think that is what I would like to end with as the summary of this fantastic panel. But I would also like to take the opportunity to invite Kajsa Gutterstam from the Swedish Institute. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for all nice and very interesting discussions. I will just say a few words about the exhibition upstairs. We opened it yesterday. It's called Pioneer the Possible, Accelerating the Green Transition. It's produced by the Swedish Institute for the Embassy. And it's about the climate crisis. It's really about what we have been discussing today. And it's also about collaboration. Sweden will be fossil-free by 2045, but we cannot do that alone. Climate crisis doesn't do country borders, so we have to do this together. So it's a lot about collaboration, and there is a well-used model in Sweden called the triple helix model, where academia, private sector, and the government works together. So it's presented upstairs. You can see the three chairs there on a carpet, and that's like an interactive station for the triple helix model. So collaboration is really important here, and I think this has also been quite obvious in the presentations here. But it's also about the sectors, the industry that needs to shift, and and the industry they all represent the green transition. So it's about energy, sustainable production. It's about transportation. It's about green buildings. So, and in each of these sections, we present great innovative solutions to the green transition, and many of them also operate in the US already. The exhibition will be there for 1 year. I will be here today to answer questions if you have any when you pass on the way out. And also I would say that the yellow tension bands up there, they're also symbolizing the collaboration. So have a look on the way out, and thank you very much for, I think you will close the seminar, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I will also take the opportunity. I'm representing Sweden-US Green Transition Initiative, and we set out to accelerate the green transition in collaboration. And we haven't talked much about what we do, but our thematics are actually correlating to the themes of the Pioneer the Possible. And I have my team here, so while you look at the exhibition, also grab them. Can you please stand up? So this... So if you have any questions to us in the Green Transition Initiative, you now have the faces of us as well. And with this, I would like to give a warm applause to all the panelists and to all of you that listen to us.